I'll be reading from Genesis 3, verses 17 through 19. Then to Adam he said, because you have heeded the voice of your wife, and have eaten from the tree of which I commanded you, saying, you shall not eat of it, cursed is the ground for your sake. In toil you shall eat of it all the days of your life. Both thorns and thistles shall bring forth for you, and you shall eat the herb of the field. In the sweat of your face you shall eat bread, till you return to the ground, for out of it you were taken, for dust you are, and to dust you shall return.
Well, I was not successful. I had hoped to get this into 2 lessons, and it's going to take at least 3. So this will be part 2 of at least 3. We'll see how it goes from there. I knew that it was going to be a lot of information, and the deeper you dig, the more revealing it becomes. And so I really wanted to not have to rush to get through this, because it's, first off, it's not easy, and then secondly, because there is so much. I think it is a fact that we know that there are always going to be questions anytime we face circumstances like we've been facing in our country and around the world about the presence of God and God's role or no role in the situation, whatever the case might turn out to be. And so when we talk about why do people suffer, why is there pain, how does God work in the world, why are there tragedy and accidents and sickness, and you have people who will take the argument and run any number of ways with it to try to explain it. To review last week, we talked about the fact that there are those who contend that there are 3 statements, and not all of them can be true, that God is all good, God is all powerful, and that evil exists, that 2 of the 3 can exist, but they would argue that all 3 of them cannot exist simultaneously, and we talked about that last time. We also, last week, talked about that godly people do suffer, and we looked at the example of Job. We talked about the fact that God allows people to suffer, and notice we looked at the language to determine how it was that the Bible seemed to indicate that God hardened Pharaoh's heart, and the Bible also said that Pharaoh hardened his heart, and why those 2 things could be reconciled. And what we determined was that the truth is, based upon the original language, that God allowed Pharaoh to harden his heart, and that's what he did. We also looked at examples of a number of godly people who we know from their situation had suffering. And then we concluded last week by talking about the fact that when God created the world was perfect, but it was because of the entry of sin in the world based on the decisions of Adam and Eve that pain and suffering also entered the world. This morning I want us to look at some of the reasons why people suffer. The first thing that I want us to notice is what we would sometimes refer to as natural evils. Natural evils. Now, God doesn't create evil. So we know that if it's a natural evil, that it's not something that has been created by God. And what I think we have to ask ourselves the question is, how much of what occurs as a result of the things that we're going to look at are a result of human activity? About things like the fact that there's a whole lot more blacktop now, or concrete now, than there has ever been. And that's changing the temperature on Earth, and as it changes the temperature, what happens to the environment in terms of environmental storms and climate change and all of that sort of thing. So what is it that we look at when we see these things that make some of them appear to be so difficult? I want to look at a couple of those, and I've selected hurricanes. Now, you know, we've got a hurricane right now. What is it? Hurricane Heather? Hannah. Walter, I was going to ask about Hurricane Heather. Now, Hurricane Hannah is now, I think, been downgraded, but we see the storm result from Central Texas and Corpus Christi, that area, about how powerful it was. And what we know is that hurricanes and cyclones, which are similar in nature, are importantly positive things in our society. And when you see all the news, and you watch all the devastation, and you see all the stuff about all of the destruction that's caused, and all the flooding and buildings knocked down and roofs come off and all this sort of, it's all negative. But the truth is that science tells us that if it wasn't for the fact that we have hurricanes and cyclones, there are a lot of places who would have great shortages of water. They also help to balance out temperatures around the world. It helps to move some of the warm air away from the equator and pushes it toward the poles. And if it didn't do that, the tropics would be so much hotter and the poles would be a lot colder than they are, and it would throw things out of balance. So do we ever think about the fact that hurricanes provide positive things in our environment? And the barrier islands, as we refer to them, they have to have these kinds of seismic activities occur to help replenish them. Now, on the side of the island where the hurricane or the cyclone comes in, you see a lot of destruction and washing. On the backside, though, it pulls the water and sand and replenishes those barrier islands. And what would happen if we didn't have any barrier islands to help protect the nations that lie inside of those? And so is it possible that God in His infinite wisdom has provided ways to replenish and balance His creation in ways that sometimes refer to destruction? And yet we know that humans and our behavior often have an impact on some of these kinds of things that can be so destructive. What about the fact that there are things that have consequences and that the negativity behind those consequences is so horrific that people begin to question, why does God let that happen? And it's important for us to know that when we see people who continue to build these big fine houses in hurricane zones, chances are some of them are going to get hit again. If you've ever been to the Outer Banks in North Carolina, or if you've ever been in the New Orleans coast area, if you've ever been in the Texas coast area, you find out that they're in a constant state of building and rebuilding. You know, we were talking even this morning about the wonderful things that a tornado did for Union University in Jackson, Tennessee, when it took out all the bad buildings and sent the money to build all new buildings. It's the best thing ever happened to Clarksville, Tennessee. The tornado went through and picked out every nasty spot and destroyed it, left all the good stuff. How much are we going to attribute to the hand of God? And should we always blame God? Earthquakes. We thought about the fact that what earthquakes do is it allows minerals to surface onto the earth that are needed and required to help resurface the earth and allow for growth to continue to occur. Does God cause that to happen? Or does the creation of God in His infinite wisdom allow certain things to happen? And maybe more importantly, in all of those, what is man's role? And how does man's behavior affect the kinds of calamities that we sometimes see? Ask yourself the question, in a global pandemic, what role has man played in all of that? Secondly, not only do we have natural evils, as we sometimes refer to them, but we have decisions that are made by humans that often result in bad decisions, and that suffering is something that can be and often is self-inflicted. Why did Adam and Eve suffer? We talked about that last week, and you can read all about that in Genesis chapter 3. What about the story of David and Bathsheba? Now, you and I know the story of what happened, and we can recount that pretty easily. If you have your Bibles, turn to 2 Samuel chapter 12. 2 Samuel chapter 12, I want us to look at just a couple of verses together. And let's recount while you're turning to 2 Samuel 12. Let's look at, or talk about, David's sin. Now, David decides, after he looks out and sees Bathsheba, that he wants Bathsheba. And he proceeds to try to figure out how is he going to make Bathsheba his, right? He conjures up a plan. It results in the death of Uriah, her husband, and then he takes Bathsheba to be his wife. Now, when we look at 2 Samuel 12 and the first few verses, Nathan tells a story to David. And to recount the story, basically what he says is there's a rich man and a poor man in a town, and the poor man only has one small animal, and the rich man desires to have that man's animal, and so he goes and takes it. And remember how David reacted? He said, "Tell me who that was and I will get that guy." And Nathan says, "It's you. Because you had everything as king, and you took away Bathsheba from her husband, had her husband murdered. And why have you," verse 9, "why have you despised the commandment of the Lord to do evil in his sight? You've killed Uriah the Hittite with the sword. You have taken his wife to be your wife, and you have killed him with the sword, the people of Ammon." But now notice what happens in verses 10 and following. "Now therefore the sword shall never depart from your house, because you have despised me and have taken the wife of Uriah the Hittite to be your wife. Thus says the Lord, behold, I will raise up adversity against you from your own house, and I will take your wives before your eyes and give them to your neighbor, and he shall lie with your wives in the sight of the sun. For you did it secretly, but I will do this thing before all Israel, before the sun." So David says to Nathan, "I have sinned against the Lord." Nathan said to David, "The Lord also has put away your sin. You shall not die. However, because by this deed you have given great occasion to the enemies of the Lord to blaspheme, the child who is also born to you shall surely die." And Nathan departed the house. Now you and I know what happened after that. The baby is born. The baby gets ill. David begins to grieve and plead basically with God not to take his child. But the destruction that's going to happen in David's household for them and for generations to come was severe. Who did it? Who's responsible for it? You see, the suffering that David feels in this occasion is because of his own terrible decision. We're all born with the ability to choose. In Joshua chapter 24, Joshua says, "Let me give you a history lesson." And in the first 14 verses of Joshua chapter 24, he recounts all of the wonderful things that God has done for the Israelites and how he's preserved them and how he's taken care of them and how he's provided for them, and over and over and over again, all of the things that they did to abandon God. And so Joshua, continuing the thoughts from Joshua chapter 23 and chapter 24 and verse 15 says, "You can continue to serve the gods of your fathers that they brought over from the time that they came up out of Egypt, or you can serve the one true living God who sustained you and brought you to this point in time. As for me and my house, we will serve God." They had a choice. And when you look at the choice that they had, he wants them to know that there will be consequences of the choice that they make. Romans chapter 6, verses 16 through 18. "Who is it that you are slaves to obey? Are you going to be obedient unto Satan and slaves to unrighteousness and evil? Or are you going to obey God and have righteousness in your life?" They had a choice. And that's what Paul wanted the Romans to understand. Why do good people sometimes suffer? Because sometimes people make bad decisions. Suffering can also be the result of something that is self-inflicted. In Deuteronomy chapter 30, Moses, the language in Deuteronomy chapter 30, Moses lays out as logically, clearly, and systematically as he possibly can, and succinctly, I would add. He says that here's what's going to happen. God is going to bless you. He is going to provide for you. He's going to give for you. He's going to sustain you. He's going to go before you as He has. He's going to provide you with protection as long as you follow Him, as long as you obey His commandments and His statutes and His laws, I think is the way Moses described it. He said He's going to bless you with the land that you're going to possess. But in verse 17 of Deuteronomy chapter 30, he says, but if your heart turns away from you, and you do not hear, and you're drawn away, and you worship other gods and serve them, I announce to you today, you shall surely perish. They have an option. They have a choice. They can obey God. They can give God His rightful position or not. Moses just wanted them to know in advance. When you make this decision, you need to be able to live with the ramifications. Paul said in Galatians 6, don't be deceived. God is not mocked, for whatever a man sows, what? That he's going to reap. Reaping and sowing. It's a science principle. And what Paul told the Galatians is that if you sow to the flesh, you will reap corruption. And if you sow to the Spirit, from the Spirit you will reap everlasting life. Sowing and reaping. And so suffering can be self-inflicted if we choose to make bad decisions. And you and I know that for every sin there is a negative consequence. And sometimes the consequences are more grave than in other instances. And I've listed some of those. Sometimes those can be very destructive. Sometimes they can take life. They can hurt. And so as a result, we know that based upon the activities that we become engaged in, we can, as a result, create suffering for ourselves. Now, I want us to look at one example. There are many. Let's use the example of cancer. And for any of you who have had cancer, or your family members have had cancer, I apologize for using this example because it can really strike a nerve. And our family certainly has been hit with it. It can be a biggie. But we know that cancer, in some instances, is linked to the choice that people make to smoke. Now, some of you will probably know that as knowledge about the impact of smoking has become more aware, the awareness of what it can do has also changed. I want to get where I can see the reaction of some of the older folks in the room. Where are you? I guess if they're still over here. Look at this. Do you remember when doctors endorsed smoking? Give your throat a vacation. Smoke a fresh cigarette. They simply didn't know. You can't read that little first paragraph, but it says, if the cigarette you're smoking burns your throat, switch to Camels and see the difference right now. And when I researched this, you can find these from dentists. You can find these from respiratory care doctors who will tell you which cigarettes are the best ones to smoke. Think our knowledge has changed? One of my favorite doctors, Henderson, Tennessee. My favorite doctor used to tell me how much I needed to lose weight the whole time he's blowing smoke in my face. You think that now that there's any difference between making decisions based upon knowledge and making decisions when we're completely in the dark? And so I would ask you, as knowledge has changed, there are those who smoke 5 packs a day and are proud of it because they've never seen any problems. And there are some who've smoked very little and get cancer. You and I know that the decision to do so was a choice. And so will the ramifications be. If someone engages in a behavior that results in a detrimental aspect to their life and pain and suffering, and it was their choice, do we blame God? Did God cause that to happen? Or is pain and suffering the result of their own individual choices? But there are other ways to get cancer. We're using that as our example. We're now told it can result from other people around you. We call it secondhand smoke. And we talk about what happens when people who smoke inside cars with little children and problems, and what happens to babies when they're born whose parents smoked the whole time that they were pregnant. We know all kinds of things about what happens, not just to you, but to other people as a result of smoking. We also know that cancer can come as a result of pollution. For how many years did the water run downstream and it carried those chemicals from a local farmer or from someone who raised cattle or from an industry that just pumped their sewage into the stream and let it flow down and come forward? With toxic waste dumps. We lived in Paducah, Kentucky, the home of all toxic waste dumps. They have spent billions to try to fix what they put underground to develop uranium. Some of you old enough to remember the Love Canal? The housing development that's built on top of a toxic waste dump, and the cancer rate of people who lived in that community went sky high. It can come from the actions of others, not just from you. It's not God's fault. It's not God's fault that somebody buried that and then somebody built a community on top of it. But do we blame God when those people get cancer? And we know that cancer can come from things that we don't even know about. And so why do bad things happen to good people? Sometimes as a result of the actions that we take, and sometimes as a result of actions of other people. And we are connected to the potential to be injured by other people. There are examples in Scripture of where that's the case. In Joshua 7, the Lord said to Joshua, "Stand up, what you're doing on your face. Israel has sinned. You violated my covenant that I've commanded you to keep. You've taken devoted things and you've stolen them. They've lied. They've put them into their own possessions. This is why the Israelites can't stand against their enemies. They turn their backs and run because they've been made liable to destruction. I will not be with you anymore unless you destroy whatever among you is devoted to destruction." So what God said is, I in the past have given you protection, but because of your decisions, we're going to let you, your families, your children, and your ancestors no longer have the protection of God. Did God cause those things to happen? Or did He allow them to happen? Jonah, go to Nineveh. You remember what he did? Jumped on a boat, grabbed him a crew, and headed for Tarshish. Not Nineveh. They get out to sea, the water starts blowing, the crew says, "What have we done? Jonah, who are you, and what have you done? What do we need to do?" They start casting stuff out of the boat. They're afraid because of the way the boat is rocking up and down that it's going to sink. Jonah says, "Throw me overboard." They said no, they wouldn't do it. They're trying, and then finally they relented and cast him in. And you know what happened to Jonah and the fish. What was the result of Jonah's sin? You'd have to interview the boat mates, I suppose, to know. what the impact of his sin in that case was. Herod hears about a baby child that's going to be born that they're going to call the King of the Jews. Go find out about this baby and do something about it. Kind of gets the outmaneuvered sidestep from the Magi. Herod gets mad and he says, okay, if I don't have that baby, the only thing I can do to make sure that we take care of it is kill all the babies in Jerusalem. Kill all the boy babies in Jerusalem. Scriptures in Matthew 2 describes the weeping and the wailing and the gnashing of teeth. How much did the sins of Herod affect other people in that instance? There's a lot of pain that comes sometimes just as a result of collateral damage. We are connected to others, and there are innocent people who sometimes suffer because others choose to be greedy, or have lust, or hate, or addiction, or selfishness. That people are killed on highways. If I chose to go 140 miles an hour in my Venza, no, I can't use that one, in my Mustang. If I chose to go 140 miles an hour in my Mustang, and I came up on a curve, we never got that fast, and I came up on a curve where that car spun and slid and flipped over and I died, is that God's fault? We shouldn't have created a car that would do that. It's my fault, right? And my pain and suffering is self-inflicted. But what if I'm doing that 140 and I come around that curve and there's a van full of school kids? And in my car spinning around, it hits that van. And it kills several of those children. What did they do wrong? What about their parents that are grieving? You know, when we look at that, do we then say, how did God let that happen? Did God put the pedal down on the Mustang? How does a good, loving, compassionate God didn't have anything to do with that except give me a choice. How stupid do I want to be? When we look at the number of people that are killed every year by drunk drivers, by people who knew that they should have stopped because they became drowsy and they were sleepy. One of the hardest situations I ever had to deal with as dean of the college was when they came and got me and said, we have 2 baseball players who went to Jackson, went into a gas station with empty milk jugs and got 2 gallons of beer and drank it and drove back to campus and came around a curve too fast and wrapped their car around a tree. And one of them was dead. Whose fault was that? Was it mine as dean that I didn't have a system to try to make sure that didn't happen? Was it their parents that they didn't give them all of the training that they should have had? Was it the gas station owner who allows 2 young men to stupidly walk out with 2 gallons full of beer, knowing what they're going to do? Was it the kids driving the car? I think if you look at it and you consider the fact that there are lots of injuries that occur as a result of the actions of other people, and I use slander and gossip. Probably have told you the story about the preacher who got himself in big trouble when it was reported that he had 6 cans of beer in his boat when he came in. And the reputation in the community was destroyed immediately. Here's what this preacher did. And then they discovered that the 6-pack was 6 cans of 2-cycle oil bundled together in the same way that cans were. The damage was done. The reputation was ruined. You can't get it all back. I want us to think about the fact that there are a lot of things where people are suffering in our world as a result of the decisions that others have made. And some of the saddest circumstances for me are the ones where we see particularly children suffer because of bad decisions that parents have made. Or we see parents suffer because of bad decisions that kids have made. And the Scriptures describes any number of activities that man gets into that creates serious problems. I went back and read that whole passage in Malachi again, because it's the description that leads up to the culminating statement that said God hates divorce. Have you ever looked at the rationale before that statement occurs? Read Malachi chapter 2. Romans 14, for no one lives to himself and no one dies to himself. You can't make decisions that aren't going to affect anyone else. They are. If you make good decisions, then you're not adding to their pain and suffering. But if you make bad decisions, they are. And so you take extra precautions. You try to make sure that you're doing the absolute best you can and thinking through it all the time and trying to rethink it. But there are some reasons why bad things happen. Sometimes it does come from natural occurrences. Sometimes from bad decisions that we make, and sometimes from bad decisions that other people make. But this we know. Lord willing, next Lord Day, we're going to look at some additional reasons, and I think we'll be able to finish up next Sunday morning. Why do bad things happen to good people? There's a lot of reasons. And in almost every instance, it's not because of what God did. God's good, God's loving, God's caring, God provides, God gives His best, but God has expectations for you and me. You see, if God says, I'm going to protect you, but you not doing anything to protect yourself, you didn't fulfill your obligation. You drove the car too fast. You drank too much. You took too many pills. God can be good and loving and kind. But what's our part? What's our role? This morning, we're going to sing this song as a means of encouragement for you if you have a need to come and to respond to the invitation. Please do so right now.
All to Jesus I